Hi, I'm Michael Hughes, and this is Contract Mastery.
Let's take a look at paragraph 7A, which deals with access, inspections, and utilities. Seven A says that the seller shall permit the buyer and the buyer's agents access to the property at reasonable times. The buyer may have the property inspected by inspectors selected by buyer and licensed by TREC or otherwise permitted by law to make inspections. Any hydrostatic testing must be separately authorized by the seller in writing. And the seller, at the seller's expense, shall immediately cause existing utilities to be turned on and shall keep the utilities on during the time this contract is in effect. Okay, well, let's break this down a little bit. The seller shall permit the buyer and the buyer's agents access to the property at reasonable times. The seller does not have the right to exclude the buyer from the property once the contract is signed. The contract very plainly states that the buyer and the buyer's agents shall have access to the property at reasonable times. Now, you can't be, going, 10 o'clock at night or something like that. It has to be a reasonable time. The buyer is allowed to have the property inspected by inspectors that are selected by the buyer and that are licensed by TREC or otherwise permitted by law to make inspections. So the seller cannot dictate who's going to inspect the property. The buyer gets to choose the inspectors. But those inspectors have to be either licensed by TREC as an inspector or they have to be otherwise permitted by law to make inspections. And when we say otherwise permitted by law, we're talking about people with specific licenses who can inspect components and equipment that are related to that license. So, for example, HVAC technician can perform an inspection of the HVAC system. A plumber can come in and inspect the plumbing, an electrician, things like that. When it comes to property inspectors, these folks are licensed by TREC, but it's interesting to know there are different types of TREC licenses that are issued to inspectors. The first one is called a professional inspector. This is a person comparable to a real estate broker. They are fully capable of doing anything and everything that has to do with property inspections under a TREC license. One step, I guess, down from that is a way to look at it, is called a real estate inspector. These folks are required to be under the indirect supervision of a professional inspector. The professional inspector is responsible for the actions of the real estate inspector, and they must be available if needed to consult with or to assist the real estate inspector. I guess this would be comparable to our real estate sales license. And then a step below that is a category that we don't have anything analogous to on the real estate sales side. That's called an apprentice inspector. These folks are required to be under the direct supervision of either a real estate inspector or a professional inspector. And when they say direct supervision, they mean that the supervisor is responsible for the actions of the apprentice inspector. That person must be available if needed to consult with or assist the apprentice inspector, and they must be physically present at the time and the place of the inspection. A professional inspector must have completed at least 200 real estate inspections before they can sponsor an apprentice inspector. Inspectors are licensed by TREC, very similar to the process that real estate licensees go through. There's an application process, there's a background investigation, and there is an examination before the license can issue. They have continuing education requirements, and for inspectors, they have insurance requirements. It's either liability insurance or a cash bond that they can post in a minimum amount of $100,000 per occurrence. Inspectors are susceptible to consumer complaints and also disciplinary action by TREC. When it comes to hydrostatic testing, all the contract says is that any hydrostatic testing must be separately authorized by the seller in writing. There is a specific TREC promulgated form that exists to authorize hydrostatic testing as part of a residential property sale, and it's called Addendum for Authorizing Hydrostatic Testing. One thing to remember about the hydro addendum, it must be signed by the seller. The listing agent cannot agree to permit hydrostatic testing. That has to be done by the seller himself or herself. Paragraph 7A also says that the seller, at the seller's expense, shall immediately cause existing utilities to be turned on as of the effective date of the contract and shall keep the utilities on during the time this contract is in effect. Oftentimes, listing agents, you're going to come across a seller who has already moved out of the house, so the property is vacant, and the seller decides that they don't want to continue spending the money on utilities while the property is vacant and it's in the process of being sold. What you should explain to them is the seller is setting themselves up for a headache, because as soon as the contract is signed, the seller is required to have the utilities turned on immediately. And remember, the buyer's option period is ticking away during the time period that we're waiting to get the utilities turned on. For electricity, that can usually be done in a day or two, but for mud districts and turning the water on, that can take a week. So the best thing to do is just explain to the seller how important it is that the utilities be on. Otherwise, we're going to have problems in the transaction. It could end up busting the transaction if we can't get the utilities turned on. So please do try to convince your sellers that the best thing to do is to keep the utilities on during the time that the property is under list. Plus, I mean, you want to keep the AC on and running, because once the air stops circulating around, especially if you're in a very warm or humid part of the state, which is pretty much all of Texas, the house is going to start experiencing problems if it simply sits idle with no air circulation for a long period of time. So, best course of action is to keep the utilities on while the property is under a listing agreement. And of course, once it gets under contract.